So what can you expect from our section 1 of our jQuery UI session? In this first section, we'll introduce to what jQuery UI is and what its main usage is. And beyond that, we're going to explore and understand what jQuery is. So we're actually going to start with understanding what jQuery is and understand that it's the foundation block underneath and behind the hoods for jQuery UI. We'll then move over and understand jQuery and what its main usages are and why was it developed. Once we do that, we'll then explore and understand what are our best alternatives to integrating both jQuery and jQuery UI into our website. Is it through a hosted CDN or is it through a direct download? We're going to look also at how to customize a jQuery library and create a customized download in this session. We're going to look at a live example. We're going to start with a very simple example, a hello world type of example, where in the end of it, we're going to be using jQuery to create 4 different buttons on our stage that would then link into a website. And that really covers the essence of what we're going to be covering in this section. I know you probably just want to start playing with jQuery UI, and I completely understand you. Well, it won't take us too long, but we have to take a step back before we talk about the jQuery UI. I wanted to talk about jQuery, which is that core library of that jQuery UI is dependent on. We're going to talk more about that in the next video, but let's first understand what jQuery is. So I'm just going to flip onto the jQuery website. Alright, so the current build of jQuery as we're making this video is 1.91. The versions are updated all the time. What is jQuery? So before we understand it really, we have to ask ourselves, well, why are there so many different libraries out there to try to help us, the HTML, JavaScript developers? One of the biggest issues with HTML is that it's a hard language. Not only that it's a hard language, it's built in a structure that's very unfamiliar to people that program in general. And it's a really complicated language to understand, mainly not the syntax of the language, but mainly understanding the structure of the DOM. We're not going to get into that at all. jQuery, in many ways, is here to solve that problem, simplifying the way that we interact with the browser to get our information. But more than that, it turns into a facilitator, making sure that when we're asking something from a browser, we'll get the same thing throughout the different browsers, which is a very important thing. As you probably know, and if you don't, every single browser has their own little mistakes. Every browser has their own issues. Although browsers and browser manufacturers are getting better and better, they also don't have the same features or the same level of support, and many times some are lagging, some are followers, some are leading, some lead in some things, and some follow in others. So it's really important for us to have some sort of layer of defense that we could work with and know that whenever we're working with that library, we know that it's safe and we know that whatever we're doing we'll get whatever we need. So developing in multiple browsers on your own without a library, well, there's no better way of saying it than it's just a big pain, and it's quite complicated. And that's why a lot of people struggle along building in HTML, not because it's a hard language, but mainly because there's too many things you have to worry about. Too many browsers you have to worry about it. One of the beauties of jQuery is that jQuery is there to simplify your work, and at the same time, its main goal is to make sure that you don't have to worry about cross-browser issues because it supports all the modern browsers. Actually, it supports all the current versions minus one version. So for example, if you're working on Opera, then it will support the current version on Opera and the version before it. Safari, same ways, Firefox, same, Chrome, the same. But with jQuery, it will support only for one dot, doesn't matter what, it will support Internet Explorer 6 and up. For jQuery 2, it will support 9 and up, but we're going to be working with jQuery 1 underneath the hood, so we don't have to worry about jQuery 2, because we do want to still make sure that we support Internet Explorer 6, because it's still a very popular browser. And if at all it costs from us is to work with jQuery 1 instead of 2, then, well, it's a price worth paying. So we know that jQuery is, it's lightweight, it's cross-browser compliant, which makes our lives way easier. So now we have a library that makes sure that we don't have to interact directly with the core features of the JavaScript library, and instead of that we could interact with it through a mediator, and that mediator is the jQuery library, making sure that it catches all these different bugs in the process that some of the browsers have. With that said, let's a little bit of background about jQuery and why would you want to use jQuery over other libraries. Well, jQuery is the most popular and the most visited. So in just a little bit of numbers, 55% of the top 10,000 most visited websites on the web use jQuery. So 55% of the biggest websites in the world use jQuery. So it's the most popular library in use today. jQuery is free, it's open source. It's with the MIT license. Dig deeper into it if you need to understand the legal ramifications of it. And as we said, jQuery is designed to simplify the way you approach and navigate the document. How do you select elements? How to create symbol and more advanced animations. How you handle events, and even deeper stuff such as Ajax applications. So with that said, that's all we have to really know about jQuery. Now, why did we do all this intro about jQuery? Because we need now to say that jQuery itself runs behind the hood with the jQuery UI. And actually, for the jQuery UI to work, you have to first embed also jQuery itself. So now that we know that jQuery is the foundation behind jQuery UI, the next question that you'll probably ask yourself is, what is jQuery UI and what makes it stand out versus jQuery, or what does it add into jQuery that jQuery on its own doesn't have, which we will find out in the next video. In the last video, we stopped as we finished understanding what jQuery is. We're not going to learn jQuery at this stage. Now, if you don't have any familiarity with jQuery, I do encourage you to get familiar with it before you continue. With that said, you don't have to get too familiar with it because we'll go through the things you need to know in jQuery as we go and work with the jQuery UI. With that said, I strongly encourage you to get more familiar with jQuery before you move into jQuery UI. So let's start talking about what jQuery UI is. Well, as the jQuery team most eloquently said, jQuery UI is a curated set of user interface interactions, effects, widgets, and themes built on top of the jQuery JavaScript library. Whenever you're blah blah blah. Well, long story, what they're basically saying is the jQuery UI is an enhanced features or enhanced set of features built on top of the jQuery library. Among those enhancements are mainly visuals, so while jQuery does not get into the visuals at all, jQuery UI is all about visuals. It has basically 3 sets of features that come with the jQuery UI bundled up if you download the whole set, the whole download, which is a big download. It's about 230K if I'm not mistaken, if you download the whole library. But we're going to look at how could we cut down the file size. But before that, let's get and understand what it is. So one is you get interactions, and what are interactions? Are the capabilities of adding, in a very, very easy and intuitive way, creating draggable, droppable, resizable, selectable, and sortable elements using the widgets and using the interactions inside of jQuery, basically enabling us to make things draggable, which is something that we would love to do very, very easily, make our elements resizable, selectable, and sortable, which is awesome. That's the first bundle of elements, which are the interactions and the enhanced user interactions that the jQuery UI library adds. The next set of features are widgets, which there are quite a lot of them, and I'm sure that in the future with different versions of jQuery UI, there might be others, there might some that will get removed and some that would be added. But currently, as we're looking at it, you can see the library of widgets, if it's an accordion widget, and a lot of other widgets that we'll explore some of them and see how to work with those widgets. Last and not least is a whole bundle of effects that enables us to add a lot of interactivity to our elements in a much more intuitive and more deeply integrated into the way things worked with jQuery. So although jQuery created animations, the jQuery UI added features and animations to support the different custom widgets that are created and the different, and in many ways the widgets are in the heart of everything, but through those widgets, interactions and a lot of new types of animations and easier ways of creating animations have been introduced and incorporated into it. So that's really, in a nutshell, what jQuery UI is. Who should use it? Should you use it on every project? Not necessarily. But if you have a lot of user interfaces that demand an accordion and a dialog box and a menu and a progress bar and so on and so forth, it could become a very valuable mission because it'll cut down your coding time dramatically because everything is almost done. And all you have left to do is to be familiar with the way the widgets work, and that's what we're going to be doing in the next couple of hours. So that's the jQuery UI, a much simpler explanation. We didn't have to dig as deep as we did with the jQuery itself, because the jQuery UI, all it really is a building block on top of the jQuery library, expanding us into actual physical things. While jQuery was just a library enabling you to do whatever you want, the jQuery UI enables you now to add specific libraries and widgets and interactions that are more tailored and custom to applications, applicable applications on the web that are popular today. And obviously, as the years go by, I'm sure that as other things become popular, so will jQuery UI update and add features and remove features based on that. Now, the current version of the jQuery UI is 1.10.1, but the versions change all the time, so just make sure that you have the latest version and make sure that you're working with the latest version of jQuery that you want to work with. As we've said, we're going to be working with the jQuery 1. Whatever current version is 1.91. We're not going to go to the jQuery 2 because for us, it is important to support IE 6, 7, and 8. We don't want to alienate those user base because there's no reason for us to do so. We want to get as many people as we can to be able to see and interact with our work. That basically covers it. And in the next video, what are we going to be talking about? In the next video, we're going to be talking about how do we actually download these libraries. Starting from downloading the jQuery library, we're going to see how we're going to incorporate that into a live website. And then we're going to move on to the next page where we're going to be looking at how to customize and download our jQuery UI elements. Alright, so this video is going to be a quick one. You need to make a decision now between downloading jQuery by just clicking on that big orange button on the jQuery.com website or using a hosted solution. It's a very popular option where Microsoft and also Google offer the files hosted through a CDN, basically reducing dramatically the load on your own server, as the jQuery file is a heavy file, 32 kilobytes. Not only that, if it's coming from the Google CDN or the Microsoft CDN, you could expect that users already have that cache in their computer, reducing your load time even more. So you'll find in our appendixes to the videos, you'll find the links to the Google hosted option or the Microsoft option. Both options are good options. When you're working locally on your local hard drive, it's probably a better idea to download your current version of jQuery and just work locally. And then when you're ready to go live, to move to the jQuery that's a hosted solution. And one more thing that I would say is just make sure that you're using the minified version. And you'll see that on the Google network, it only offers the minified version. And on the Microsoft version, you do have other alternatives. This becomes really handy when you're in development, but it's best to always use the minified when you go into production, because it's a much smaller file size. Now, with that said, literally all you have to do if you're on the Google CDN is just to grab the script and just paste it into your header or your footer. Now, most of the pros in the industry say that your best bet is to put it in the footer, because as long as you don't have any code in the application that is modifying your HTML, and literally if you're a clean JavaScript developer and you're making sure that you don't do anything before the application loaded, or at least you're not modifying anything in the HTML before the document is completely loaded, then it's not a bad idea to place your script on the bottom just before your footer, and we'll practice that as we're building our application. I want to show you one example of an application before we complete. And by the way, don't worry about capturing what's written here and pasting it. We're going to actually do a live sample in 2 videos from now. So really, this is just to give you a premise to understand what are our options. So I just want to show you really quickly at 0togeek.com, which is my website. If I jump, which is my online training website, you'll find in my source files, if I look at the page source, although I'm not doing what is the right practice, at least currently, you'll see that in my header itself, I placed the jQuery script, although it's recommended to go all the way to the bottom of your page and just paste it just right before the end of your body, placing your tagging. You can see I'm doing that with my Google Analytics, but I am not doing that with other JavaScript libraries, mainly because, things rolling, sometimes you don't get a chance to do it. With that said, if you're starting over from fresh, it's not a bad idea to start that way, because it's going to improve your load time of your site, because the things on your page are going to load faster even before the interactivity and the features of it come, which will come later on as the JavaScript loads, if your JavaScript is not as critical. You have other options of putting a defer attribute in the script, but don't worry about that if you don't know what that is. Try to make sure that you always put your JavaScript as the last thing before the end of your body. If it doesn't work, then just put it into the head and work that way. That's probably your best solution until you get more comfortable with the decision process. And that covers it. So that was our overview of how do you get the jQuery, the decision between downloading it and the option of using a CDN. I always work with a CDN when I'm actually on my live site. There's no point in clogging down my site And beyond that, it's really great if other people are using that CDN and other websites are using the CDN, then our users don't even have to download it because the files are cached on their system, hopefully. And that covers it. In the next video, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about our options for the jQuery UI, which are a little bit different because the jQuery UI is a very, very big library. It's 230 kilobytes. There's no reason in the world for you to need all of it, but we're going to talk more about that in our next video. Welcome back. So just like in our last video when we explored and saw our options of should we make a local download of jQuery or should we use a hosted option from the Google or the Microsoft CDNs, we have the same option again with the jQuery UI, only there's a little bit of a difference. The jQuery UI JavaScript file, both on Microsoft network and the Google network, are everything that the jQuery UI has. And as we've noted already earlier when we were looking at the different capabilities, it has a lot of capabilities. Do you need all those capabilities? Probably not. You're not going to use every single element. You're not going to use every single thing inside of the library and every single website that you build. But if you upload or you use that CDN, you're basically forcing the user to have at least 230K downloaded, plus the actual, because they have to also download the jQuery itself, they have to have at least 260K before they even did anything, which is a lot. So I don't recommend using the Google CDN at all for jQuery UI, nor do I recommend it from the Microsoft. And by the way, Microsoft also offers the CSS directly on their server, which we're going to talk more about CSS in a later video, so it's a side note. But I don't recommend using those CDNs, and actually I recommend you going into the jQuery UI website itself and then creating a custom download. You're going to actually integrate that custom download into your application, and we're not going to run too deeply into it right now, but we're going to practice this in the end of the 2 hours of our sessions. In our custom download, once you click on it, you'll see that you could build your download and basically configure what do you want to download from the version to the different components and features of the jQuery UI library, making sure that you're only downloading what you need. Now, one more note to say is that jQuery itself has a CDN as well, and actually you might and you could, if you're using one of the default CSS files, or you're using, or you decide that you want to use the full jQuery UI, you could then decide that you want to use the CDN of those files, which are basically 3 files that you're going to have in every jQuery UI project. You're going to need your CSS, which is going to be the themes and the colors and the features and the images and all the goodness that are going to come in the different components that we're going to be using. And you're going to need the JavaScript, the jQuery, whatever version. We're probably going to work with the latest one, which is 1.91. And you're going to need the jQuery UI itself. Now, I personally would not download or use the CDN because the file is going to be very big. But if you end up saying, oh, well, I'm going to use everything on my website anyways, and I'm using all the different components, then, well, it makes sense then to use the CDN because, again, then you leverage that power of the fact that it's not coming from your server. So really, it's just a question of balancing between what is your basically balancing between those options. So to cover what we talked about, we said that we had that option of downloading directly or using the CDN. We're going to choose to download a custom version. We're actually going to download the full library, the full stable library. And in the next video, we're going to open up that file and create a small little sample project to wrap up this section. All right, so it's time for us to start coding. This is going to be really easy and simple. We're going to wrap up everything we've done so far in the last couple of videos and see how we create a first button on our own. So let's see what we're going to be creating. What I want to do is, if we look at our application right now, we have a basic HTML file. In that HTML file, there are 4 links, just regular HTML, simple links. There's no JavaScript, no CSS, no anything. We have our header, we have our body. We're in the HTML5 world, so we're using the HTML5 doc type already. And that's our starting point. And from there, what we want to do is we want to convert all those hrefs, all those links into buttons using the jQuery UI button component. Now, to be able to do that, our steps are going to be, we're going to incorporate the jQuery, then we're going to incorporate the jQuery UI, and then we're going to pick whatever CSS we want, and we're going to use the default CSS, the default style CSS for the application. All right, so let's get started. First of all, we'll see what links we're going to be creating. So I'm going to actually take the links from my website, zerotogeek.com, my main links, the courses, books, tools, and blog. And I'm going to basically link users to that. And all we have left to do is to convert all this into buttons. So let's start doing it. So our first step is, as we said, we want to make sure that what I want to do is I want to, right after our title, I'm going to go and create a new link. And it automatically filled up for me a lot of information, which is awesome. And my next step that I want to do is I'm just going to copy here from the side the CSS of the CDN. Of the default jQuery CDN link. Now, by the way, in an HTML5 world, we don't even need this type CSS anymore because we are in an HTML5 world. It's kind of not needed. And last thing we want to do is we always want to close anything that is open. So we'll make sure that we're closing that HTML just to keep our HTML valid and legal. Again, not getting into the rules of HTML, but basically any tag you open, you must close. Most of the time, and in this case with a link, we want to close the link down as well. All right, so the next step is we want to add the jQuery information itself, and for that we're going to create a new script tag, and in that script tag we could delete all that type because in HTML5 world, all the script information is automatically always going to be JavaScript. And in our source, we're going to set our source to be, again, we're going to copy from the jQuery URL, so let me just copy that just for a second. And I'm going to paste right inside the CDN of jQuery and get the jQuery itself. Now the next step is we want to create another script tag, so I'm just going to copy that script tag again. And this time around, I want to copy the jQuery UI from the CDN. And again, now we're just doing it because we want to create a quick example without worrying about our download. Although we downloaded already the file and we could have selected the specific one that we need. But in our case, we're creating a fast and dirty application. And at this stage, that's all the configurations that we have to do to get our application to work. Now, at this stage, we have jQuery loaded in, jQuery UI loaded in as well, but we're not going to see anything, and mainly because we didn't tell it what we wanted to do. So our next stage is going to actually give it a couple of commands, and for that, I'm going to create a new script tag. And again, we don't need all that extra goodness. And I'm going to use a kind of, you could call it almost a hack, but in jQuery, you could actually just send a function into the dollar function. And by sending that function in, it's going to call it as soon as the page is completed loaded, as soon as the DOM is ready. Now that we've done that and we're inside of this area where it is only going to be called once the full page is loaded, I could then move on and make sure that I want to call, let's say, all the A tags. So to do that, I'm going to select all the A tags. Once I selected all the A tags, all that's left for me to do is to say, well, from now on, all your A tags are buttons. And that's all I had to do. So by doing that, now I've converted all 4 of my components and I've converted them into buttons. So let's see how that works. So if I refresh my application again, you'll see that now we have 4 buttons. And if we click on to, let's say, our books section or our courses, you'll see that it's going to take us to 0togeek.com where you'll be able to see all the different videos that I've created so far. And that is it. So that is our simple demo quick application, and that completes our chapter really. In our last final couple of minutes, we're going to go through really quickly the tools that I'm going to be using throughout the next 2 hours, while you could use completely different tools as long as you're comfortable with your development environment and your browser and your editor. Then you're fine. You could skip the next video. If you want to know what am I using, then we'll walk through that really quickly for a minute in the next video. Alright, so this video is really to capture the tools that I've been using throughout this first section of this video training and the tools that I'll be using throughout the rest of this training. I'll go through it quickly. You could skip this if you're happy with the tools you have. I'm working on a Mac. The browser of choice that I'm working with is Safari, and I made sure that I've set the developer tools to be enabled. To do that, I went to the Safari window and then selected Preferences. In the Preferences in the Advanced tab, I made sure that Show Developer Menu is in the menu bar. Once that is set up, you could always right-click and then see your page source, as we've done earlier in a couple of videos ago. And that's really the tools from the operating system level, the Safari browser. I've been working with the editor Sublime Text. You can use really any editor that you feel comfortable with. It seemed like I just started using it lately, and it's a nice editor that I'm quite happy with. It's a paid application, although you could use it without paying it, but then it'll ask you a lot of times to pay. But overall, seems like a great tool and a good investment. So that's it. I hope you join me in our next session where we start digging deeper into the jQuery UI library and really see its potential. Welcome to section 2, which is all about CSS. And in this section, we're going to explore, first of all, we're going to add a new element to our work and file that we started in section 1. We created buttons earlier, and we will add in this section also a date picker. We're going to see how to do that. It's really easy. Once we've created that, we're going to move on into CSS, and we're going to see how we could update and use a different CSS from the different CSS templates that are offered by jQuery UI. Once we do that, we're going to move on to a step even further. And in that step further, we are going to create our own theme, which I'm going to call it Greens. And in our Greens theme, we're going to create our own custom theme that has its own exclusive rollovers and states, which is based off of another theme. We're going to learn about the overall structure of the CSS files in jQuery. We're going to see a couple of tricks of how to do it really quickly, and we're going to introduce ourselves to the ThemeRoller. All in all, this is going to be a really fun and exciting chapter, and once you're finished with this, not only will you know how to integrate your own themes, not only you'll know how to add more widgets, you'll know also how to customize how they look like. So without further ado, let's jump in and let's start learning. Alright, so before we jump into CSS and really seeing it in action, I wanted to add one more component, one more widget into our application, into our Hello jQuery UI application that we started in our last example. So I'm going to select the date picker. It's really easy to add these stuff in. So let's see how we add one in. So we're starting off, this is what we have. Let's go into our code and just follow through the steps, which are really, really easy. So the first thing, I'm going to locate where I want to put it. I want to put it right after my buttons. I'm going to add a few line breaks, really just because I want to quickly be able to separate them easily visually. Probably wouldn't do this in a live real application, but for our sake and purpose, it's fine. So what I really want to put there is I want to put an input field, a text input field really. And it's going to be a type of text. And I want to give it an ID as well. So let's give it an ID of date picker. Now, the name itself doesn't really matter. Really, only when you're initiating it, it becomes important. It's a good idea to always be consistent. So if you usually use lowercase in your IDs, then stick to lowercases. If you do uppercase, then stick to uppercase. I usually use uppercase, so I do this camel casing. You choose whatever method of naming is right for you. Just try to make it descriptive enough. In this case, because there's only one date picker, well, that's probably enough. But if we were creating a site for airport company and there's two different air pickers, well, you probably need to figure out a better name than just air picker 1 and air picker 2. You probably would want to call it based on starting and ending or leaving, coming back, and so on and so forth. All right, so let's see it in action. So I've created my input field. It was that easy. Once I've created my input field, it's already going to be on my screen once I refresh it. So we're already there. Now the only thing that's missing is we want to link it with our date picker. Use moi. Now, the one thing that we need to notice and remind you at this stage is that we are already right now loading in every single element of the CSS, and we're loading every single thing in the jQuery UI. So we don't have to modify anything in our links or our CSS information. All that's left for us is to start coding. So now, a little bit more about jQuery. We are now approaching a specific element directly now that we're using an ID. Now, the way to do it is really simple. Whenever we want to approach an element directly using its ID, we start with a hashtag. So we're using the same exact function that we used to call the A tags earlier that updated all the different A tags and converted them into buttons. Now in this scenario, we want to approach only a specific title, a specific item. So we're going to use the hashtag and we're going to write there date picker. And we want to make sure that you're using the same casing. So in our case, it's camel casing because it's very important. Once we already approach it, all that's left for us is to tell it what we want it to be. In our case, we don't want it to be a button, but we actually want it to be a date picker. Now be very careful because it's really important to spell it out correctly and not use an uppercase when it's not correct. So in our scenario, actually, although our hints in this tool is telling us uppercase, those hints are only because it's thinking that that's what we typed earlier. But actually, we'd want to type picker at lowercase. We added it as date picker in the lowercase and we go back into our application. Now, if we refresh our application and we click onto the text field, we should be getting now a nice date picker to select from. So all I really want to do here is just maybe make sure before that element, and once you select it, it will fill up the information. For the sake of keeping things clean, I just want to go in here in my text input and just before it say something like select a date. So it's clear, just a little bit of information to the user, although this is just our sample. And let's maybe update our hello jQuery world to a new name with, let's call it working with style. And there we go. So that was our starting up of this section. In the next few videos, we're going to explore a little bit more deeply the CSS, understand how the CSS libraries work in general in jQuery in relation to the JavaScript files themselves as well. And we're going to see our different options of how do we want to work with them. Now that we got our first widgets out of the way, it's time for us to start talking about how they look like. And the way it works in jQuery, if we go back into the jQuery UI website, as you hopefully noticed when you were downloading the custom download, and you haven't done that already, then please do. When you click on to download a custom download, you see beyond the selections that control the JavaScript side, they control also the CSS side. Now, the first thing that I want you to note is that when you look at the bottom of the themes themselves, when you could select a theme, you'll see there's a lot of different types of themes. Now, in our case, for example, if we wanted to use smoothness theme, if we're actually going to look into our code currently inside of our application, we'll see that currently we're using the theme base. Now, we're still loading every single thing in the jQuery library. We're both loading every single thing in the CSS that it has to offer and everything in the JavaScript that it has to offer. Now, on the JavaScript end, we don't have to ever change anything when we change themes. The themes are 100% controlled through CSS. With that said, it's really, really easy to just immediately convert every single thing you have inside of your theme itself, completely change the visuals of it by just changing this folder. So if you're using the jQuery.com CDN file, which I hope you are currently, you could very easily just change the theme. And I want to show you how to do that really, really easily. So first of all, you could look inside of the website itself and basically choose the element you want. So, and literally the name that you'll see here is really the name that you would have to type inside of your inside of that folder area. In our case, I really want to use the smoothness. So I'm just going to select the smoothness. I'm going to copy that, go back into my code, and in my code, I'm just going to replace the base, which is the base theme, and just replace the base theme with the smoothness theme. Once I've done that, I could go into my HTML hello jQuery UI world. If I refresh the file, we'll see that now we're working with style and our style changed. And we can see that our style looks a little bit different, not that much different. So let's give it another try. Let's try another theme. Let's do something completely different. How about we go for the mint chocolate, which I believe that a mint chocolate would probably be really different. So with mint chocolate selected, I'm going to go right there, enter mint chocolate, click on save, go back into my file, click on refresh, and hope that I'm going to see something completely minty and chocolatey. And there we go. Our buttons are very chocolatey, and so is our component. And it's that easy. So the first step is you could select any of the styles that are in the library there. You could load them directly from the server. But obviously, if and when you're ready to go into production, it's not really a good idea to use all of them if we're only using a date picker and a couple of buttons. So that would be probably a bad move for a live real production environment, and that's something that we're going to have to cover in this section to make sure that you don't go live with 500K or 600K that you just don't need. Alright, so now that we're stylish, let's talk about something that's really important. And file sizes is probably one of the most important things you're going to have to worry about as a developer, beyond all the other stuff. The bigger your files, the bigger your server files are, the longer time it takes for users to get to your page, the lower the chances are that they're going to engage with you. Especially in this day and age where there's a lot of people with mobile devices that don't have really fast internet speeds all around the world. 4G might be popular in the US these days, but around the world there's a lot of places where it's not. Internet connections are something very, very irregular. The smaller your files are, the better chances are that more people are going to see it, the more chances are that they're going to see it faster and be engaged with it faster, and that's a really important thing to note. Until now, we were working with basically the custom build, the automatic download. So when we go into, again, to the homepage, if we click onto the stable release, let me just open up what file structure you would have downloaded. You're actually, and this is the files that we've been really working with, you would see that we would have our CSS files themselves, And if we look at the minified file, it would be 26 kilobytes, which seems like not too bad, right? And we could have gone then, we would then have also our custom jQuery file, which would be 228 kilobytes. So overall, we already have about 250 kilobytes easily before we did anything. Now, obviously, there was a lot of advantages because we got a lot of it, but with it, do we really need everything? In our scenario, let's say if we were done, and these are all the components that really we're going to be using with jQuery UI, wouldn't it be smarter for us to download a customized version and minify only that custom version? Well, jQuery UI's platform with the custom downloads exactly solved that problem. So let's just go through that process really quickly. So first of all, I'm going to toggle off all the different options of the components. Now, the first thing is I'm going to toggle on everything in the UI core because it's a required dependency that let me stutter a little bit more, that most functionalities just need. So we're just going to assume that we need all of them, and that's fine. We're going to take that assumption. Now, for interactions, we're not doing anything with dragging or dropping or resizing or anything of that nature, so we don't have to worry about it. Now, in our widgets, the only widget that we're using is button and date picker. So if we're using only button and date picker, let's only select those two. For effects, we haven't used or implemented any single effect, so we don't have to load any of them. And all that's left is for us to select our flavor of the month, in our case, our style, which will be the mint chocolate, which is the one we've used recently. Now, one more thing to note, if you are using this component, you'll notice that there is a CSS scope element. For the most part, you don't have to worry about it at all. You really only have to worry about it if you're adding more than one theme. And in that scenario, you could force a scope to the CSS, basically providing the ID of the scope. So the CSS will only work inside of that bucket, inside of that ID. And it's the same ID structure that you would work with jQuery if you're familiar with it. So just as we said we only want to talk to the date picker, you would put inside a scope specifying exactly what the scope of that component is, making it easier for you to then use two different scopes, two different CSS files if need be. All right, but in our case, we're only working with one style at a time, so we don't have to worry about it, and you could click on the download file. I've downloaded the file already in advance, so I'm just going to toggle right into there. And when we look into the downloaded file, you'll see that our file, let me put it just one next to each other so we could even compare it, you'll see that everything together was 228 kilobytes earlier, but now it's only 63 kilobytes. And when we look into the CSS itself of our mint chocolate, we'll see that our mint chocolate is only 21 kilobytes. So we sliced off quite a lot of file sizes in our automatically just by doing that. We cut a big portion, almost 200K out of our file, making sure that 200K that weren't needed didn't load. And that's an important thing. Every time you're working on any production on the web, you want to make sure that you're putting the best that you could at the least amount of file size that you can. And that covers it. And in our next video, we're going to continue exploring CSS. So let's continue. In the last video, we downloaded the custom skin, the custom style, and the custom JavaScript files that we're going to be using in this semi-small project that we're working on. At this stage, I just want to integrate it into our project. To do that, I'm going to go right into our source code of our file and just add a new JS folder and a new CSS folder. Into the JS folder, I want to drop inside our custom, and let me just throw this into the screen for a second. I want to add our custom JS file. We want to take the minified file because we're really not going to go inside of it and edit it. We're really just using the components. If we were working on building up components and creating some of our own, we probably would want to use with the custom file, which isn't minified, before we're in production. But because we're never going to go into these files and actually modify them, we could go ahead and be ready for production already. So I'm going to grab the JS file and put it into the JS folder, and I'm going to grab the CSS file and place it into the CSS folder. So let's start with the CSS, and I'm going to grab it right inside, and same for our JavaScript file. I'm going to paste it right inside, and here we go. So first of all, let's start with our CSS file, which is inside of the CSS folder. I'm going to go into our HTML file, and really all I have to do is I'm going to delete everything in our CSS right now, and I'm going to point to our folder and our CSS file. I could save that, but before we're done, let's move back into our Finder, and let's do the same for our JavaScript file, because just by doing this, we're going to literally cut down 200 kilobytes from our file. So again, for the jQuery file itself, we're leaving it on the server. We haven't customized it. For the jQuery, So many words. But for the jQuery one, for the jQuery UI, they should have a shorter, more fun name to pronounce, but they don't. Never mind. So let's continue. So for the JS file itself, for the UI that we converted, we want to upload it. We've done the 2 files. We made sure that we've done it. All that's left for us is to go into the file itself, click on refresh, and make sure that everything is still working, and everything is still working. And that's all we had to do to update it locally. And that's literally how you would build your file structure from start to end. When you're pushing it and pushing up a new project up live, you figure out exactly the components that you're using with. You could start with using the live links that are on their server. Like that, you could test the issues of loading time and things of that nature. Once you figured out what it is, you download the custom files that you want, plug it in, and upload it onto the web. Now, our last video in this section is going to be all about CSS. We're going to have a little bit of an explore of how are the styles built out of. We're not going to dig too deep into it, so you're not going to learn how to become a style editor yourself, but if you have enough familiarity with CSS, our next video alone will be enough to get you started with playing around and understanding how the CSS structure works. Alright, so at this stage you've been working now with jQuery UI for a while. You've used 2 different widgets, and you've even explored some of the themes and how they work. In this video, it's not a mandatory one. Again, you could skip this video, but in this video we're going to dig into the CSS structure. It's really an overview and kind of a hint towards if you want to start building your own widgets and you want to start customizing your own widgets and customizing the themes themselves. So without further ado, I'm going to jump right into the development bundle. And in our case, because we have a customized version of jQuery UI, if you remember, we only downloaded the button and the date picker. Once we double click into the bundle itself and go into the themes, so I'm going to go into the themes folder, you'll find inside of there all the different CSS files, but literally only the files that together combined will be able to make our button and our date picker work. We're not going to see anything but that. With that said, just as a side note, you have a minified folder, which in it you'll be able to find all the files also minified as well. Now, if we jump into the files themselves, really we're breaking down into, if we had to cluster them into 4 different file types, there are 4 file types. One is the all file type, then there's the base file type, there's the core, there's the theme, and then there's the different types of components. All right, so let's take a little bit of a look. Let's explore starting with the all. And as the name implies, it basically loads everything up. It loads the base CSS file using the import parameter. I think it's called derivative. Well, it imports the base CSS and the theme CSS. Now, the theme CSS has everything to do with the theme specifically. It's a very big file. Let's start with that because it's the most simple one. It has a lot of CSS and a lot of details that go into the details of overall things that relate to the widget, from rollovers and how things look like when they're disabled, and icons and widget headers and so on and so forth. It doesn't go specifically into any feature of a specific widget. It doesn't talk about buttons. It doesn't talk about anything about date pickers, but it goes through every single feature that is generically applied to all the different components. All right, so that's basically the theme, and the theme is loaded with the all and the base. Now, the base file itself loads a lot of other stuff. It loads the core and every single other component of every single other widget. So the core itself, what does the core contain? The core CSS file contains things that are very generic, that apply to everything, but are very low level before any, it's literally only low level elements of the library itself. Now, when it goes down into the button itself, the button doesn't hold every single thing related to the button, but it holds everything that's related specifically to styling of a button. With that said, if I had an icon in the button, or I had something, a label in the button that isn't explicitly directly connected to the UI button itself, you would find it inside of the theme file. Alright, so basically it goes through every single file separately. The accordion holds things that are specifically associated only with the accordion, and so on and so forth. Your core holds really the most basic things, and the theme holds the holistic everything, cleaning it up, making it all work all together. All the stuff that are not a specific accordion, but are related to accordion, but related to everything else as well, you would find inside of the theme CSS file. And that's basically the file structure itself. In this course, we're not going to dig too deep into the CSS files themselves and modify them, because that's not our main focus. Our main focus is getting you really up to gear with how to work with jQuery UI. In our next video, we're going to explore one more feature that is going to be really great and really useful if you want to create your custom themes in a really easy and fun way. And we'll explore that in the next video. To wrap up this topic of talking about themes, I thought it's appropriate to talk about the built-in feature that enables you to create custom themes without even knowing CSS, which is kind of awesome. And even if you do know CSS, without needing to worry about CSS too much. It's all done through the ThemeRoller, which you could find in jQueryui.com/ThemeRoller, I believe. But let's see. Yep, ThemeRoller. So once you click into the ThemeRoller, you'll discover that there's literally so much possibilities for you. So first you can start with the gallery and select one of the pre-built themes. So let's say we like the frog, but we don't love the frog, so then we could click and roll on your own, and all the different components of the frog will be inside there, and I can literally go one by one and change what I want to change in it. If I want to change the font, if I want to change, let's change to something really small. So corner radius right now is 10 pixels. Let's change it to 20. And you can see that our components just became way rounder than they were. Let's change it to another something. Let's figure out some rollover state. How about that? Let's change the rollover state to be red. And it's time for us to check it out. And here we go. Our rollover state is red. And now if we're happy with it and we're done with it, we could just click on download the theme. And there we go. We just have a completely new theme. We just created it in a couple of seconds. It's absolutely amazing and so fun that you can see every single thing on the screen as you're doing it and see how it reacts to you as you're building it out. That's all I wanted to say about ThemeRoller. It's incredibly intuitive. If you don't know something about it, you could always click into the help itself, but literally it's so intuitive that there's really nothing much to think about. You just select the element that you want, click on the roll on your own. Once you do that, you could just go through item by item and start modifying it until you're happy. Once you're happy, download the file, integrate it into your component, and voila, you just created a custom theme without needing to know how to build the CSS elements of it at all. How's that for something cool? So that's it for us on this segment. In our next segment, we're going to learn something completely new. So let's move on to the next one and find out what that will be. Welcome back to our third session. And in this third session, which by the way, the third and the fourth sessions are probably the most important sessions of the book or video. Well, we're not a book, right? But what are we going to be learning? Holistically, in both of them, we're going to be learning everything you need to know about the basics of working with any widgets from the API perspective. In lesson 3, in this group of videos, we're going to be talking about mainly 3 things: about how to customize components, from what customizable options do we have dynamically to change in components and how to find them. We're going to see what type of methods could we call and how to call them in action. And third, we're going to see events. We're going to see there are 2 different types of working with events, which we're going to talk more about in the remainder in later videos in the session. But we're going to work on the callback version of events, which is a much more simple and easy way to work with. In session 4, we're going to dig much deeper into events and really start swimming in events and really understand how they work. So let's see what we're actually going to get in the end of these videos. So in the end of this first session, we'll be able to create a dialog box, and the dialog box will have a title of its own and some copy of its own. Well, even when we close the dialog box, we'll see that the background color is going to update, and basically we're going to know, using a callback, we're going to change the color of the background whenever the dialog box opens. So let's start learning. Let's jump right in. Alright, so it's time for us to create our third component, and actually this third component is going to be the key where through it we will learn about all other components, including the components we've created so far. This component we're going to be working on this time is the jQuery UI dialog. It really comes to replace the input dialog or the alert box, if you've heard about it and worked with it before, which are very limited in the visual control that you could have over them, and are really annoying. Users don't like them, and that's just the fact. With that said, users really don't like alerts in general or being forced into doing things that they don't want to. So be very careful about when you use a jQuery UI dialog and try to make it as fun as engaging as you can. I would say never put an alert box inside of it. If you feel like you need to use an alert box or a dialog box in an unnatural way, that probably means that your UI is bad, and it probably means you should need to take a step back and see, what do I need to do to change things here so I won't need that box? Now, if you do need this alert box, let's jump in and see how it works, and through it we're going to learn also about all the different features that are available to all components. Now, One more thing that I wanted to say, in our last section, we downloaded a custom version of the component. And if you recall, once we downloaded it, we literally disabled everything and we selected the core UI. And when we selected only the button and the date picker. Now, in this case, we're also using the dialog, but I would suggest already, if you're ready for it, how about just download, and notice something really, really cool also, by the way. So I'm going to toggle all off. If I select also now, let's say the button, only the button, and I select the date picker and I select the dialog, you'll see that automatically it's going to select all the other core components of the UI core and the interactions. So in this case, you can see that by adding the dialog box itself, we realize that we need the resizable and the draggable as well. And so do we need the position, mouse, widget, and core. So literally, you could download only specifically what you need, and that's what I encourage you to do. So once you figure out what widgets you're working with, all you have to do is just select the widget that you need. You could even skip all this because it's all automatically going to select the ones that you need. Now, for our sake, because in this chapter, we're going to go through quite a lot of components, and so in the future, I just downloaded every single component. So if you look into your source files or you download a completely original new one, you'll find the jQuery UI now is the big bulky one with everything that's inside of it. And in the CSS, you'll find our new skin, which is called greens, with all the images that are associated with it. And that's all you need to know. And at this stage, we're ready to start working and creating our jQuery UI dialog. So it's time for you to open up the dialog.html file or create a new one. Just grab the previous file. The only difference between the two files is that it has a new title and a new background. So let's get rolling. So first of all, let's see it. So we have here our new title, and I've added a background color, a background style. All right, so I'm going to go all the way to the bottom of my page, and let me just scroll it a bit up so you guys could see it more easily. Let's maybe even zoom in a bit so it's literally easy to read. So I'm really close to the bottom of my page, and I'm just going to create a new div layer. And in that div layer, I want to put in, first of all, this div layer is going to be the body itself of our dialog box that is going to open up. So I'm going to put here some sort of a message. So let's say, welcome to our site. You are going to have a lot of fun. For the div ID, I will give it some sort of an ID so we can now fetch it and actually tell jQuery UI we want this to be the dialog box. So the ID that I'm going to give to it, I'm just going to call it dialog to stay consistent with the naming convention that I've been working so far. And last but not least, I want to give the UI also a title, but let's do that in a second. So you'll see how it works without and with the title. So scrolling back up into our initiation function, once everything was loaded right after we set up our date picker, well, let's do the same exact thing, the same exact logic for our dialog. So all we have to do is select our dialog, and then we're going to call the dialog function. Instantiate it, save it, and if we go into our jQuery UI dialog HTML page, we will see that once we clicked on it, we'll see welcome to our site. You're going to have a lot of fun. Now, we have a couple of issues with it. It would be great if we could set it to be in a certain size, and actually, because we downloaded the full library, the users could come and literally resize the element and reposition it to wherever they want on the screen because we downloaded the full capabilities of the library. Now, if we didn't, we could have downloaded only specifically, we could have downloaded only specifically the dialog, and we could have maybe disabled the draggable and drawable, but it's dependent on it. So it's basically telling us, well, if we do that, then, which is a really, really easy and great way to make sure that you got all the capabilities that you need. So if you by mistake turn it off, they tell you, well, it's not a good idea because it's needed. The alert box that we have right now is great. The only problem is that initially we're a little bit smashed up, which we're not that happy about, and we don't have a title. Now, making a title is incredibly easy, so let's start with that. Making a title, we'll just go down all the way to the dialog box itself, and we're going to put a space in the div container itself, and put a new title attribute, jQuery UI stuff. There we go. Yeah, all right, so that's going to be our title. If we go back into the page and refresh it, we should now see the jQuery UI stuff as our title. Welcome to our site. You are going to have a lot of fun. There you go. So we created our component just as easy as we created components earlier. Now, the next step in this is to really modify and make sure that we could do what we want. For one of the things that we would love is to have a default maybe screen that looks more like this. because we don't really want our we don't want our H1 tag to break into 2 lines. We just want it to be in 1 line. So that's what we're going to check and look at in the next video. Alright, so there are 3 different ways to engage with a component, a widget, in jQuery UI, and I wanted you to be familiar and understand what they are before we start breaking down and seeing how to work with each and every one of them. Now, every single widget has those features. Now, the way to find them is just going directly into the jQuery UI documentation. Not that hard, so let me walk through it with you together. So if you're on the jQuery UI website, just click on to find the API documentation. In the API documentation, go to the widget, which you'll find on the side left menu, or any other area where it is if they update the design, and then scroll through to find the specific component that you want to look at. In our case, we want to look at the dialog widget, and we get into the dialog widget. Once you're inside there, you'll see that there are 3 different breakdowns of the different capabilities. Now, every single capability you could click on and see more information about how to work with it with live examples, which is perfect. Really, really easy to work with as long as you understand what are the options, what are the methods, and what are the events. So what are options? Now, options and methods are approached in a very similar way, and the only difference between an option element and a method is that options are properties and methods are functions. So for options themselves, we will change or send information, while for methods, we will send a function. Now, or send a function or call a function, either or, one of the two. So we're going to start with options. We're going to see how do we modify a few options. Then we're going to look at a later video how to control methods, from literally overriding a method to calling a method. Now, the third element is events. And events are something that we do out of the widget itself, basically telling the widget, whenever something happens to you, let us know. So, such as, for example, whenever you start dragging, please let our function know about it. Whenever you're resizing, please let us know about it. Now, many of these different events are available throughout all the different widgets. And literally what you want to do is just go to the widget technical documentation, to this UI API documentation, and just go through and be familiar with any widget that you really want to work with. Now, in the next couple of videos, we're going to be exploring the dialog widget, so let's get started. In the next video, what we're going to do is we're going to select a couple of the options that we want to change. Really, the most notable ones right now is that we want to set up our jQuery UI stuff dialog box to look better. In our current scenario, we really want it to be bigger, wider, so it's easier for us to look at. And we're going to explore a few other ones. So join me in the next video where we're going to start playing with the different options of any widget, and in our case, the dialog widget. Alright, so let's continue, and literally our first step that we want to do is we want to have our default width to be a little bit wider. So let's start playing with it, and literally let's go into our options in the jQuery UI, try to find the option that is right for us, which is the width, and start exploring with it. So literally you could just click on the width if you needed to see extra information, and you can see that you have a few options. One is by entering the information as soon as you create the width, and the other one is by approaching the selector itself and updating it. But we will use the initiator itself. So let's get rolling and let's start doing it. So literally what we want to do is we want to go into our dialog initiator, add a new object inside of it, and in that object start putting properties, and the property that we want to approach is the width property. And literally all we need to do inside of here, add the width property, and then select the specific width that we want it to be. So let's do that. Let's do that. All right, so let's start width, and I'm going to set it a width of, let's start with a width of 400 pixels, and let's see if it works out. If it doesn't work out, we could always return again. So just to note it, really, really important, really quickly, if you're not very, very familiar with JavaScript and how it works, what we're doing is we're sending an inline object. We could have created the object externally and created a new options object, and just create the object externally and then send the options object directly into the dialog, but because we're only going to use it once, there's no need for us to create an external variable, so thus we're sending the object and creating it at the same time. Once we've created the object, one of the properties right now is the width, and we're going to explore and add more properties in a few seconds, but let's first see that it's working. So we're going to go into our dialog, click refresh, and now we'll see that our dialog is exactly in the size that we want it to be. Well, I kind of zoomed in a bit, so let me unzoom in. And it's exactly the size we want it to be. It's the perfect size. Now, our only problem is this 400 pixels, which is the perfect size for us, we want to make sure that no one goes smaller than 400 pixels. So let's look at if we have any capability of one of maybe forcing if we go back. One of our options is to make sure that our element is minimum width, and we could set a minimum width of 400 as well. So let's do that. Let's make sure that no one could ever force us to be smaller than our minimum width. Minimum width, we're going to set to 400 as well. I'm going to save our file. Go into our application, click on a refresh again, and let's see if we could resize it down. And now you can see that we can't make it smaller, but we could definitely make it bigger. And that is perfect. Now, in our scenario again, let's limit also, we don't want the user to be able to really change anything. We don't want to, first of all, we don't want it, let's lock in the exact size we want it to be. So let's do that by approaching let's approach both attributes at the same time. So we already did the width, we already did min width. Let's make sure that our minimum height and our height is now set. Minimum, so let's start with the height. We'll go back into our editor and we're going to add your height. And let's put a height of 200 initially. And let's see if that 200 is perfect for us or not. And I'm going to click on a refresh button. And maybe 200 is a little bit too much. We might want to cut it down a bit, but we're going to be happy with that. But what we will do is in our editor, we could add here another min height and set it to be a minimum of 180. We could click save and we will refresh. And if we see that, we'll be able to make it a little bit smaller, but we won't be able to make it much smaller than that. And that makes us really happy. So visually, we're pleased. Our component is looking good. Let's explore a couple more properties because we have some time. What I wanted to do is I'm not going to go through every single property. One of the stuff that I want to do is, let's say we want to disable the default property of draggable. Currently, our element by default could be dragged, but maybe we don't want it to be draggable. All we have to do is grab that draggable element, go into our Sublime text or our editor of choice, and I'm going to set it to be false. Now again, if you don't know the properties, you don't have to know. Just click onto the button itself and see what are your options. And literally, if you would click into the draggable itself, you would see more information and examples of how you could set it up. And that's all you really needed to be able to convert whatever you needed to convert. All right, so now that I set it to be false, if I click here, refresh, and I try to move our component, you'll see that it's not movable. It's still resizable, not resizable, but we can't move it anymore. Probably not something that we'd want to do, but we could do it. And that's one of the stuff that you want to explore and find and figure out. And so the one thing that I just wanted to show you is that you could also change the title itself through the options. And to do that, I'm just going to do that really quickly. And if you go into your options, just add a title. You could remove the title that you have underneath there. And let's try to promote my website and my Twitter nickname. So let's do here, check out zerotogeek.com and follow 0togeek. All right, so I could change my title. I change my title if I go into the page itself and I click on refresh. We will see that check out 0togeek and follow. Unfortunately, we're not getting the whole copy, but at least we know it, that it would be follow 0togeek.com. And how about maybe we change it really quickly because we really don't want 0togeek not to be in there. So let me just make our width a little bit wider. Let's do that really quickly. So we're going to go to our width, and I'm going to make our basic width maybe 440, and we're going to let people hide my title. That's going to be fine. So we're going to refresh that. Well, we actually need a little bit more. Let's do 480. Oh no, we need a little bit more. All right, fast. I don't want to take your time. 530, save. Let's get that out there. Ah, lovely, beautiful. Now it's a little bit too much, but I'll fix that in between our videos. All right, so in our next video, we're going to continue exploring the jQuery UI component structure, the widget structure. We looked at the options already, and our next step is to cross into the methods. And I do encourage you maybe to pause in the videos and just walk right into the navigation, into the jQuery UI documentation. I will leave a link in our documentation as well. In the code itself, I will leave a link. And just go through every single one of them and just get familiar with them. That's going to make you feel more confident. And literally, you'll see when you work on other components, you're going to see how much things are very similar. If it's the width and the height and changing, and if it's resizable, and there's a lot of different features that are available throughout all different components. All right, so we're going to see you in our next video, which is going to be about methods. All right, so we looked into a various amount of options in every widget, and in our case, we've been working on the dialog widget. But hopefully, in between the breaks, you explored and played around with a few other options. In this video, we're going to start exploring the methods. We're not going to go through all of them right now, but we're going to see a few of the basic ones, such as close, open, and destroy, and we'll see how they work. And their job is to close a component, open it up, or destroy it. We're going to look into the isOpen and see how do we fetch information to be able to get some information from our widget. Without further ado, I just walked up a few steps. Without further ado, let's just jump in and start playing with it. So I'm going to go right into our code. And in our code, I want to show you how do you approach a different method. So first of all, I'm going to only start working with it after our dialog was created. So I'm going to go to line 23. And in line 23, I'm going to approach our widget again, basically going to our dialog. And in our dialog, I'm going to call the dialog function again, but this time around, I'm not going to send into it options, but I'm actually going to ask it to do something. So I'm going to ask it to close. And that's literally all I had to do to be able to close our dialog. Now that I've saved it, I could go back into our application and I could click on refresh, and I'll be able to see that my dialog was automatically closed. Now, to make sure that it's still there, how about we add another function right after that, and we could ask it to open up right after that. So I'm going to just copy the whole thing again and ask it to open. If we go into our page again and we click on refresh, we'll see that our dialog will open up automatically. Now, you might not want to do this in an automatic way, but you might want to have some sort of button or some sort of functionality that once it's done, this dialog button will go away, such as if you have some sort of interactive feature within your component, which you could put inside of it whatever you want. Last thing I want to talk about in this section, well, in this current video at least, is our destroy function. So our destroy function is in the exact same way. It's the same method. The way we approach it is through the dialog, and all that's left is to just call the destroy function. Once I call the destroy function, even if it's open, it will basically annihilate it. But I probably have a spelling error. Let me make sure that I wrote destroy correctly. Destroy. Let's go right back in there. Destroy. Yeah, that made sense. If I go back into our code and I click on refresh, now you'll see that our component was destroyed. Not only was it destroyed, it also returned our basic HTML back into the page. Now, one thing to note is once I destroyed our component, I cannot call it again. So if I try to call open again, it will have no idea what I want from it because it doesn't exist anymore. Thus, after I destroy it, try to open it again, there's no way to open it because there is no component there anymore. Alright, so that covers the basics of how do you approach a component and how do you open it, close it, even destroy it. Now, the next thing I wanted to talk about is if you wanted to check, for example, let's say we want to create some sort of a toggle that if it's open, then we want to close it. If it's closed, we want to open it. How will we do that? So, well, it's easy enough and very simple. We could leverage that isOpen method, and the isOpen method would return a Boolean value that would be true or false. And because of that, what we could do is we could just go right directly into our code. And in our code, we could type here an if statement. And we could put inside of that if statement our dialog method. But this time around, we will type inside I think it was isOpen, right? Let's check. isOpen, yep. So back into our code, isOpen. Now, if it is open, then we're going to do one thing. If not, we're going to do a completely different thing. So if it's open, we want to close it. And if it's closed, we want to open it. Now, obviously, this example is not a very realistic one, mainly because, well, we know it's open because it is open, right? If we wanted to, we could have added another, well, there's no point in adding much more than that, but in this case and scenario, initially when our application opens, our dialog box will be open. And because it's open, we're going to automatically close it. If at any stage the automatic state of our component was closed, then we're going to automatically open it. Obviously not the most logical example, but here we go. So our component is now closed, and it's because we closed it with our if condition. So that covers, we just covered really, really quickly 4 out of the basic methods that exist in every single component. So, well, in most components at least. We closed it, we destroyed it, we checked the isOpen, and we checked the open. We will talk about the other ones in a future video. The move to top we're not going to talk about because it's quite intuitive. The move to top will basically push it up. If there's other things underneath it, it's going to make sure that it goes right on top. It's going to be the top widget around, just by calling it. The options in the widget we will explore later on. Now, in the next video, we want to break out from methods. We saw now how to work with options. We saw how we could trigger methods that create an action such as closing and opening or destroying something. The next thing that we want to do is we want to look into events, and events enable us to listen in. Basically, whenever an event happens, such as something opens or something closes or something gets dragged or something gets created, we want to know about it, and maybe we want to do something in those scenarios. In the next video, we're going to explore a couple events and we're going to see how the events work in action. Welcome back. We already finished working on options. We know how the options of widgets work. We even know how methods work, at least most of them. Now, the next thing that we want to do is we want to explore events. We're not going to check every single event. We're really just going to give you a tease and a taste so you could go on later on and start playing with it. Many of the events are common to all scenarios, and all really what you need to know is just to be familiar with the different types of events and when they're done. In this video, we're just going to explore a couple of events, mainly seeing how to work with them. Now, the first way we're going to do it, and by the way, there's two different ways of working with events, and it's true in a lot of different languages. One way is using literal events, and the other way is using callbacks. Let's start with callbacks, and then we'll move on to events. Now, the big difference between callbacks and events is that a callback is literally we hand the function to the widget and say, hey, call this function whenever you're ready. On the other hand, events are the other way around, where we ask the widget, hey, could you let me know whenever something happens so I could call this function? It's literally a different step, and why would you choose one of the two? When you're using a callback, you know you're only going to use that one function forever. You're not going to use any other function beyond that. While when you use events, with events you could trigger a few functions at the same time by adding multiple events at the same time. Now, we're not going to cover multiple events at this section, but let's cover the two different types of ways of doing it. So let's start first of all with our dialog box. We want to make sure we're going to, initially first what we want to do is we want to go into our code, and I'm just going to cancel out all the code that we made in our last section. And I want to start over by, literally what I want to do is I want to go into our event, I want everything to be open initially, and what I want to do is I want to start adding callbacks. Now, the first callback that I want to add is whenever my event is closed, because right now it's open. Literally what I mean is when I click on this close button, I want to I want to know about it so I could do something. And the way to do it is incredibly simple. The way you do it with callbacks is you go into the options of the dialog, just add another comma, and add a new option, and that would be the option. Once you do that, you're going to send in the function, and literally you're sending a full function into the open property, you could say, but it's a callback. Now, this callback is in the same category as events right now. In that callback, this function is now only going to be called whenever our component is open. And as our component is opened as soon as our application starts, how about we change the background color as soon as the application opens? So the background color that we want to choose whenever our application opens, let's approach first our document itself. So I'm going to approach my body, and my body itself, I want to update the CSS. Now this CSS property, if you don't know, this is an attribute not of jQuery UI, but of jQuery. And because the jQuery UI library is based on jQuery, we can approach also jQuery library elements. The CSS option basically enables me to put inside an object that just lists out different components, different CSS attributes that we want to update. And what I want to update is the background. And for the background, I want to put a background color. So I'm going to set here a color, a dark color. Let's make it 33333. So it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 times 3. Because it's red, green, blue. All right, so I'm going to save that. Now I've updated the color. All that's left for me, and obviously you could choose whatever color you want. Once I've done that and I go back into my application, hopefully when I click on refresh, I will see that my dialog box opened, and as soon as it opened, also the background color of my application has changed. Now, obviously if we close our button, if we close our button, nothing's going to remove back. So we want to also update that. So let's go back into our application. And what we want to do is, how about we make a completely different color again? So I'm going to comment out, and let's also use the close function, or the close callback. And in the close callback, we could literally do basically the exact same thing, only this time we could pick a different color. So how about whenever the component is closed, we're going to still be in the gray tones, but how about we go to a much lighter gray? So it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And here we go. Let's give it a try again. So when our component is open now, we're going to have a dark gray. As soon as we close it, our dark gray will turn into a light gray. So we've worked now with callbacks, and literally that's all we had to do to be able to create really, really easy callbacks using jQuery UI. Now, there's a few other callbacks that we could call, and literally every single event is a callback as well. So if you want to approach something directly and you just want to work with callbacks, well, you're fine. In the next video, we'll explore a couple other callbacks or events, but this time we're going to approach them as events. But you could do either or, you don't have to do both, but it's good to know both in case you have to open up someone else's work and you'll need to explore and understand what's going on there. So in the next video, we're going to continue working with events, but this time around we're literally going to create instead of callbacks, we're going to create real, good old-fashioned events. In the last session, we learned the basics of working with events, we've learned how to work with the methods, and we've even learned how to work with options. Well, in this one, we're going to group up everything we've learned so far to break into the world of events. And events are very simple, although we're going to dedicate it a whole section. We're going to dig into how events work. It's another way of working, just very similar to the way you worked with callbacks so far. Now, what are you going to get out of this course? In the end of this session, you will be able to not only the features that we had available before that, our component now will move, and when it moves, we'll have a color change in our element, and you'll see also that in our title is going to change and show us where exactly our position is. Once we drop it, our title will reset back to what it was before that, and once we click onto the X button, we will be back to the way we were originally. So we're going to add a drag and drop, and we're going to add a few more features talking about the in-depths of how events work. So let's start learning. Alright, so until now we actually covered everything. We covered options, we covered methods, and we even covered events using callbacks, but we have a small problem. If we tried to use the drag event, we would notice that it would be really useful to have some information such as where is our property, where is our element right now on the stage. If we're dragging it, that might be useful information that we might need. Using callbacks will be a little bit more complicated, although completely doable, to do it. But beyond that, we were talking also earlier in the earlier video about the other reasons why you would want to use events and not only use callbacks. But let's jump in and see how callbacks basically, well, we saw how callbacks work. So let's say, for example, we wanted to implement now the drag. Now, in the drag, we already saw how we added a different callback, but we want to see also how do we add a different event. Now, the way we work with events is really simple. So let's first implement it, and once we implement it, we'll go down into the details of what's inside of it. So let's jump right into the code. And in the code itself, I'm going to go right out of our constructor of our object. So that would be right here, I believe. Yep, right here. And we're going to call again our dialog itself. So we're going to approach our dialog. And our dialog itself, instead of going to the dialog as we've been doing so far, now once we're in the dialog itself, we want to add an event. And in the event itself, the first thing we want to say is what type of event. And the type of event that we want to add is the drag, right? Because that is the event itself that we're working on. So, well, dialog drag is the actual name of it. So the drag event is a dialog drag. So we're going to copy that dialog drag. And we're going to add that into our event and literally just go into the documentation and look at it and make sure that you know how to do it. So now that we've added the event, we have two options. One, we could call this on dialog drag, which is a really good naming convention to start your events with an on to make sure that whenever you look at them, you know they're a callback. They're not a callback, or you could use that also for callbacks. But once you create that, you could have made it an inline function. But we're doing something different now. So I'm going to call a function. It just is really helpful when you call it on in the beginning because then you know it's a callback / event, which is the same for our sake and purpose. On dialog drag. Now, on dialog drag gets two things sent to it automatically. It gets the event itself, and the second thing it gets is some more UI information. Now, we're going to explore those UI information elements really soon in the next video, but before we start exploring the UI event informations, let's just make sure that it's actually working. To make sure that it's working, I'm just going to grab and I'm going to change the color of our element again, and we're just going to change our color to something completely different. So red, green. Let's make our application a lot more green than it was until now. So we're going to, how about we make it completely full here? And we'll notch this down to, let's say, 7.7, and I'm just really randomly doing this. So we'll have a green that is not too saturated. So let's give it a run. Let's just make sure that we spelled everything out correctly, because that happens to me a lot of times where I don't spell things correctly. Drag, darg. There, you see? I always do that stuff. On dialog drag. On dialog drag. There we go. Save the day, hopefully. Alright, so hopefully we won't have any errors. Let's just make sure that everything is fine here. So we created an on. We set the event itself. Now notice that your events, if we go back into the beginning here, which is an important thing to know, you're not going to go just call the create because it could be something else that's being created. So when you click on the create, you'll see what is the actual copy, which is basically the name of the component, the type of the component, plus the action when you're calling the on event. Alright, but in our case, we're using the drag event, so we're calling the drag event, which is then we create a function, and that function automatically receives an event and a UI extra information. Now we'll dig into those extra informations in the next video, but for this video, we just want to make sure that everything is working. So once we created the on drag, we should see that our color changes to green. How about we go there and give it a run? Once we move our component, which we can't move a component, so we have to go back into our code, go back into our properties and find where we set our draggable to be false and comment that out. We're going to save it one more time. Go back into our application, and this time around when we are able to drag it, our application is going to change background colors to green. Looking a little bit better. How about once we finish dragging, so on drag and on drop, let's find the drop method. So if we go up here, let's look, we have start. Our drop method would be drag stop, which drag stop is dialog drag stop. So I'm going to copy that and go back into our code, and we are going to literally just create quickly another function, and we're going to just call on dialog drag, and we'll have your on dialog drop. On dialog drop will then change the color back to whatever current color is, which is a perfect time for us to implement our need to know, basically, is it open or is it not open, right? But even though we do know it's open because we just dragged it, so, well, let's not get too fancy. So I'm just adding the event itself really quickly. So literally what I did is I added the dialog drag stop event in the exact same way as I did the dialog drag, and then I'm having it call the dialog drop instead of the dialog drag. So once the dialog drop ends, we should want to trigger which one? We want to trigger the color of when the background is open. So I'm going to copy that, or probably would be a smarter move to create some sort of a function up above in our initiator, and let's call this open color. We're going to treat this as a static color, and we're going to put in that color right inside there. And instead of calling it directly in case we want to change the color at a later date, now that we have two different places where we're putting the color, we are going to just paste the color right into where it's supposed to be. Click on save. So I was really doing this quickly, so let me just run through this one more time. So what I did is I created a variable inside of our constructor, so it's going to be available to everything inside there, inside of our starter up function. And our open color, we just set the background color to be that open color, which was the same color. We then added two events, a dialog drag. On the dialog drag, we changed the color once. And on the dialog drag stop, we changed the color back to the color that it was when it was open. So let's see if it works. Let me just save this. Let's go into our code, click on refresh. And now once we start dragging, it should turn green. And once we release it, it should go back to our gray color that we want it to be. And there we go. We just created a very interactive feature. In our next video, we're going to start exploring the actual details of that UI property that's inside of our event to make a little bit more information available to our users. We already covered options, methods, and events, but I really want to dig a bit deeper into events, and we're going to learn a lot. So instead of telling you what we're going to learn in advance, let's talk about what you're actually going to be doing by the end of this video. So our goal by the end of this video is that, one, is to make sure that when we're moving around our controller, we'll be able to see more information about what is being changed, such as the X and Y coordinates that are being moved. We're going to learn also a little bit more deeply about how events work, and a little bit more deeply about the event's UI extra parameter in the function. So without further ado, let's jump in and start working. Now, the first thing that's problematic about our code right now is actually when we're dragging right now, because we use the function, we use the method drag, the drag method is being called every single movement. That means as we're moving this, it's being called plenty of times. Now, the way I know that is very simple. I can also show you how I know that. So, first of all, what I want to do is I want to add another line of code in our code. And so we're going to go into our code, and on our drag property, on our drag callback / event, I'm going to add a code that says console.log, and I'm going to just type here, just here for now. All right, and literally what I'm doing here is I'm basically telling the browser to log into the system and to log in the copy here. Now, the way for me to see it, and it really depends on the different browsers that you're working with, but if you're working in Safari as I am, then you're going to do it in one way. And if not, you really want to know how to do this. If you don't know how to do it, if it's in Firefox, you use Firebug. Every single browser has a different way of doing it, but the different browsers have developer tools or built in, or you have to download specific developer tools to be able to see this information. In Safari, as we saw in an earlier video, how we turned on the developer tools, now that the developer tools are on, you could go into the Develop menu and just select Show Error Console. Once you've set the Show Error Console, now we're going to see any logging information that happens as our application is running. So I'm just going to refresh to get the latest code inside. And now you'll see once I start dragging, you'll see that these numbers are moving up. You see already 68, even though I only clicked twice. And literally that shows us every single movement that we make, it updates. But in our scenario, that's not really what we need. We will definitely want that to update the text, but we don't want that for our color, because we really changed only the color once, and once the color has been changed, that's all we want to do with it. So although we still want this drag dialog to happen, we don't want it to happen to the actual color. So let's rework the naming convention that we have and discover which event is actually right for us. We worked in the right way with the stop, which happens only once. So let's look into the text, and again, it's always about going into the documentation and finding the other elements. So we have the drag start, which is the one that we're going to want. So we're going to go back into our code, and again, our drag start is going to be very similar to the drag stop, only with the word start instead. So I'm going to copy that, and I'm just going to call, instead of stop, start. And I'm going to change the function name of our onDialog drag. So let's create quickly another function onDialog drag start, and it's going to have an event, and it's going to have the UI info just as our other events. And I'm going to move our function right inside in the sandwich, right into the color. So now this color function should only be called once, and the only thing that's left for us is to connect it together. So now instead of on drop, we're going to put here start. So when the start event happens, we're going to call onDialog start. On the dialog stop, we're going to call the onDialog drop. And on the dialog drag, we're going to call onDialog drag. All right, that works for us. So we're going to leave drag because that's probably a better name for it, because it is a drag that has just happened right now. If we run our application again and I just save it and we jump right into the browser and just refresh it for a second, we'll see that we're getting literally something that looks the exact same thing, because our here is getting updated, but our color is not being updated as well. So now that we've explored that avenue and we took out something that wasn't efficient out of our code, our next step is let's get to know and be more familiar with the properties of the event itself. So for one, I want to first get familiar with the UI. And one of the nice things about working with the console itself is I could, instead of typing it here, I could just type the UI information directly. With that said, it's always a good idea to first check inside of the UI into the documentation to see what are we supposed to expect. So we can see in our type object, in our UI type object, we're going to find a position and an offset. So if we rerun our application, now that inside of our code in our UI we're logging the UI object itself that is being sent as a parameter into this event, if we refresh our code and just drag it for a second, we'll see that different objects are appearing. So let's open one of those objects, and we'll see that we have the offset object and the position object, just as we expected when we saw inside of our documentation of UI the position and the offset. We're going to ignore anything that's not one of those, because if it's an unofficial method or it's something that's not written, we probably don't want to touch it. So we have it in the offset, we have left 371, top 110. And for the present position, we have left 371, top 110. And literally for us, it doesn't really matter. Let's just work with position. And what I would really love to do is just print out our current position when our application is dragging. So let's first build up the copy. So to build up the copy, literally what we want to do is we want to go into the object and go into the position. So back inside, position. All right, so we have our position object. Next, we want to go to the left and top. So we're going to first start with left and then top. So we're going to come here, dot left, and we're going to concatenate it, adding the UI position dot. If we run this again, as our application is running, as we're moving things around, we should now be able to see our X. Alright, so let's do this quickly before I start really coughing crazy. So we see the numbers are updating, and really what we want to do next is get that copy to be inside of our title once our application is dragging, so we could see it inside of the real application and not only in the developer console. So back into the code. Now we want to figure out a way, how do we access our element? So to do that, I'm going to actually approach the event itself, and the reason why I'm doing this is the less explicit you are about the specific name of components that you're working inside of an event, the better you are. Because if you're not explicit, that means you could reuse it. If there were two dialogues or we're working on a different component like a button, and in our event we didn't explicitly talk about a specific button, now we could use whatever's inside there for every single button, such as rollover scenarios and things of that nature. So we're going to go into the event itself, and we're going to approach the property of target. Now, with that said, you could always look into the documentation to find things, or one of the easiest things is to just use your console.log and just log in your event to be able to peek inside and see what type of properties your event has. So if I refresh this and just move it just for a second, you'll see that the object itself contains a lot of information. One of the key informations that are available here are the target. There we go. So we have our target, which is actually the div layer itself of our components, which is perfect because that's exactly what we wanted. Once we know that we have that target, we could approach that target and talk to it as a dialog box. So we're going to call it dialog box. And actually, we're going to approach one of the properties that we didn't talk about yet in the options. So in our options menu, what we really want to do is we want to talk to an option. We want to change an option, actually. So if we look into the documentation and go back up all the way into the beginning into our methods, we'll see that one option is option. The way to work with option is very simple. As a second parameter, we put inside the option. So if it's disabled, we pick whatever option we want and we can get the information. Or we add a third parameter, and in the third parameter, we actually tell it what we want it to do. Such as you see here, where with disabled, we set it to be true. So in our case and scenario, what we really want to control is we want to control the title. So going back into our code, we're going to type in that we want to talk to the title. Once we got the title, our next thing is to paste inside and say what copy do we want to put into the title in this scenario. And the copy that we want to put in here is maybe as current position is, and maybe we'll break that up. And let's break a line here so it's easier to read. And we're just going to grab everything inside of this line here that was inside of our log earlier and concatenate that with that. So basically we just created a nice little short copy that basically should say current position is, and then place inside the position itself, and then close the bracket. And all we have left to do is test it out and see if it works. And let's do that. We'll go right into our application and we'll click on refresh. And now when we move it, we're going to get an error first of all. So let's fix that error. First of all, we're saying undefined, it's not a function, evaluating event.target.dialog. Oh, perfect, because we have here an error, which is perfect timing to make our video a little bit longer. So one of our problems is we tried to approach it directly, but our event.target returns our real HTML data. The real HTML data doesn't have a dialog function. To enable us to call the dialog function, we have to wrap our event.target with the jQuery function, the dollar function. Once we do that, now it's going to have all the capabilities of a jQuery element. Once we did that and we save it, we could go back into our application and click on refresh again. And by the way, I know that just because I saw that I'm trying to call dialog and dialog doesn't exist in the target. So we're going to click on refresh again. And if I start dragging it now, we'll see that our information is updating. Our only problem now is that we're having a little bit of mathematical errors. So let's fix that, which is basically because we're trying to concatenate a string with numbers. And the easiest way to solve that problem is literally to, because we have your two pluses. I'm going to delete one of the pluses, save that because plus plus is not really the right scenario here, and go back into our code, refresh it, and we should see that now our numbers are updating as we're moving it around, and we're almost perfect, and we could close the dialog box, our console. The last thing I want to do is when I stop dragging, I want to make sure that our old title goes back. So let's do that really quickly. That's not something new. We already done something similar before. So I'm just going to create a new variable, which will be called var title. And I'm just going to paste inside of it the real title, which we inputted right here. And I'm just going to make sure that I'm going to hard code. And by the way, I'm using uppercase. For the reason I'm using uppercase for our variables is just a indicator to me that these variables will never change. These are static variables, even though we're using var and variables are not static. I know that because it's uppercase, I will never update them. Now in our title itself, all that's left is to find the right place to position our old title, and the right place to position our old title will be when we drop things. So all that's left for us to do is we just have to copy this whole beautiful segment of code, delete the text that we actually put inside of our title, all of this fun stuff, and instead of that, just put inside our actual title variable, which would then update to our real text. So let's give it another shot, a little run. We click refresh. Now when we move it, everything should update. It should show us our position, our numbers. As soon as we release it, it should return our title. And there we go. We did a lot in this video. Now, if anything in it wasn't clear, please rewatch it because it was a very, very heavy video with a lot of new things that we learned and discovered. We bundled up almost everything we learned in the session, and I thought it would be a perfect way to get out of the session by repeating everything we did really quickly and adding a couple of new capabilities and features. So don't forget to download the code, and we'll see you in our next chapter because this covers this chapter. We've covered a lot of ground so far. We've learned how to work with the jQuery UI in general. We've learned how to work with its CSS, how to work with the themes, how to configure the files. We've even learned the basics of working with widgets. We've explored a few of them already. In this section, we're going to go through most of the rest of the components and explore them one by one, seeing a few features in them, giving you enough information on them so you could start working with them already. Among the topics that we're going to be covering in this section are going to be how to work with tooltips. We're going to see how to create our own stepper. We're even a spinner. Spinner is called, not a stepper. In some languages, it's called a stepper. So spinner, we're going to see how to create a menu in jQuery. At jQuery UI, we're going to see how to work with a slider, and that slider is going to control the color background of our HTML. We're going to see how to work with the accordion and see how to create content in an accordion, and we'll top it off and complete it with creating a dynamic Ajax-enabled tab system. So without further ado, let's start learning. In this segment, we're going to learn how to work with tooltips. I already got us started by putting a form inside of the HTML page. So let's jump in, see how it works. It's quite easy. So let's just look at the code. So in the code itself, you'll see that what I've added so far, I've cleaned up the files as well, so there's nothing inside of our constructor or our starter file really right now. And all you really have is a small little form. Its action is to send our opt-in information to the Zero to Geek website. Our method is going to be post, and in this course, we're not going to dig into how forms actually work. So we're assuming that you know how to create forms. In this form, though, what we're doing is we have an input box, which is a text box, and an input box, which is a text box as well. One we're using as an email, and one we're using as a name. And this is just so our back end, which will be probably in PHP, will be able, well, in our case, it is going to be in PHP, which we're not going to see at all. We're going to send this information, so we're basically sending an object that's called data that has a name and has an email property within them. So now that we have our input layers left, what I want to do next is create a new title. Now this title is not going to be visible by default, but we could give a title to give the users extra information about why do we need their name. We want to know your name so we can talk to you personally. That works for me. So really, this is just to indicate to why do we want your name and why do I want your email. So let's say title, so we can update you on future releases. So you have your basically just two input fields inside of a form. Now the only thing that's left is really we needed that title, and the title is really going to be used for that tooltip. Now literally the last thing that's left to really activate this tooltip is to basically tell our whatever elements we want to activate. And in our case, any place that has a title, we want to give it a tooltip. So to do that, literally all I'm going to do is I'm going to ask for the full document. So anything in my document, I want to tell it, well, any component there, if you got a title, we want you to be a tooltip. So I'm going to tell it tooltip, not tooltop, tooltip, open close brackets. And again, if you have options, well, if you want to customize such as how it looks like or any other thing, go into the documentation. In this training, we're not going to have the chance to get into every single feature, but just go in there and you can see what other options and what other features you could add into the tooltip. With that said, let's check out our tooltip. Let's see if it works. So I'm going to click on refresh. As soon as I roll over my name, we should see some information about why we want the name. As soon as we roll over the email, we'll see some information about the email. And we just had created a successful tooltip, and this covers our topic of tooltip. In the next videos, we're going to continue covering other jQuery UI components, widgets. In this video, we're going to learn about the jQuery spinner, not the tooltip, but as is in the title right now. I changed the background color. What is a spinner? A spinner is literally a way for you to enable your users to input text in a very controlled way, enabling you to control, such as, for example, maybe you want to let people choose to add into your form a value between 1 and 100, but they could only put the values of 10, 20, and so forth. So it basically gives you control. So what we're going to do now is let's build it out. It's really, really easy. And like any other of the components, you're always encouraged to go into the documentation and figure out how to add more features and how to control it better. So I'm just going to update the name here in the title to spinner because I forgot to do it earlier. Spinner. Yep, that's spinner. And into our body. So in our body, literally what we do is we create a new input. Usually it would be inside of a form. That input type is going to be a little bit different than what we've done so far, but the type itself is going to be spinner. The next step after your input is inside of a type spinner is literally that's it. That's all you have to put inside of your input box. And you could close down your input. Now, we want to give it a name so we could access it, so I'm just going to give it an ID so I could easily fetch it from our function. By the way, obviously, if this was something that would be submitted in a form, then it would have to have a name as well. So the information would be then sent in the post or the get to the server to give it basically a variable name that's being sent out. But let's give it an ID, and the ID that we're going to give it is spinner because we have only one spinner on the page. Our next step is to go into that starter up function that we've been working with so far as well. And literally what we want to do is just fetch that element. So I'm going to use my dollar function again, and I'm going to call my spinner. And I almost forgot to put there a hashtag before to make sure that I'm approaching an ID. Once I've done that, all I have to do to enable it and set it up is just start up my spinner. I could save that information, and that's all I literally had to do to get a spinner up and running. And if I click on refresh on my page, you'll see that now I have a spinner and I could go up and down. And just before, let's do one more thing before we close up this topic is let's see how you could limit the values. Let's say we only want the values to be 0 and 100, and we want the step size not to be 1 point, but to be 10 points. So to do that, what I would do is I'll go back into my editor and I would add a few options inside of my spinner itself. So first of all, my minimum value I want to be 0, my max value I want to be 100, and I want my step size to be 10. Once I did that and I saved it, that's all I have to do. Now once I go into my document, you'll see that if I click on the up, it's going to go 10 all the way to 100 and then stop, and all the way down and then stop. Only problem is if I'll type your 55 and tab out, I still could put a value that's not right. But that you'll have to figure out on your own. Just go into the documentation. It's quite easy to figure it out. And if you have any issues, you're always encouraged to contact me. You could find me on Twitter at ZeroToGeek. Alright, so in this video we are going to create the jQuery UI menu. It's actually quite simple. The way it works is basically you have unordered lists inside of unordered lists to create depth. So in our case, I started up with adding a couple of book reviews that I did for a couple of books. Most of them are packet books. And in these books, literally all I did is I created a list and I just started putting books inside, and you could get the full list of books on ZeroToGeek.com's book section. Now, in the code itself, let's just see how it looks like. Basically, we have an unordered list. I already gave it an ID. And then we have list items. So for example, the JavaScript one is empty, there's nothing inside of it, and then you see it's just the JavaScript, it has nothing beyond it. Well, for the Air, iOS, and Android, which has two different items inside of it, basically the way it's done is by adding another unordered list right inside of it, which is basically this one. And in it, you'll see that we have a link to one book, which is a Flash development for Android cookbook. And you can see that it's right there, we have one link, and same is true for the next one. So instead of going through each one of them, how about we just create one sample using the JavaScript one, which is empty right now. So to do that, I'm just going to break a couple of lines. And in the JavaScript line, I'm going to create another UL, another unordered list. Close that unordered list, and I'm going to put just one list item inside of it. And that item is going to be basically a link. And in the link itself, I can put whatever description I want. This is my book, published with packet. And by the way, if you've enjoyed this title so far, I strongly recommend that you check my book, which is all about HTML5 graphics and graphing and data visualization cookbook. It's a big word, but it's a fun book. I've built it a labor of love of about 6 months, and I really hope you like it, and I hope you check it out. You're going to learn everything you need to know about how to work with graphics in HTML5 using Canvas. It's a very accessible book, and I really hope you give it a chance, and I really want to hear from you and know if you enjoyed it and if you enjoyed this title as well. So we created that extra element, and we can see that now we have this is my book published with pack. So we have here all these lists of books. Now all that's left for us to do is to basically do what we did with all the other components, is basically activate the component. Now that we already have an ID which is called menu, all that's left for us, it had a trailing dollar there. We have to go into our starter function, in our constructor you could call it, and in that starter function we're going to call our menu element using that ID, this hashtag, and then we tell it to become a menu. Once we do that, we should have a menu, but we'll have a little problem because the menu is going to capture all of our screen. And when we roll over it, you might see that there's something there on the side, but it's not really good enough. What we want to do is want to limit our menu to be a little bit smaller, so that way we make sure that we could see everything. And we could do that in CSS. So I'm just going to approach our menu, and I'm just going to limit its width, and I'm going to set its width to be, let's say, 220 pixels. And let's hope that the 220 pixels will do. And if I refresh, we'll see now our menu is going to be shorter. And now we're going to be able to see all the different subcategories and even access them if we wanted to, and we could click right into them. And that's all you really have to know about the menu component to be able to start running with it. And as always, check the documentation to be able to play with the styling, to be able to play with all the different other configurations, such as disabling the menu, which you'll find in the documentation. Alright, so working with sliders is what we're going to be doing in this video. It's a bit more complicated than other sliders because you have to engage with it. You just can't drop it in and hope that it'll work. So let's just see it in action. It's as easy as all the other components to start it up. So we'll start it up and then we'll start configuring it. In our code, I'm just going to add a new div layer, give it an ID of RGB for the color because I'm going to want our slider to control the background color of our application. So what's left for us to do is to just go into our function, fetch our RGB element, and then make it a slider. That's literally all I had to do to set up a slider. If I click on refresh, we should have a nice slider there. Now, let's start configuring the information. So without further ado, let's go back into our code and let's start adding a couple of options just to make it a little bit more interesting. So in our component, it knows to be able to make it control the background color as we want it to do. So the one thing that I want to do is I want to set a maximum value of 255, which is going to be the values in RGB from 0 to 255, which is really all I have to do. Now, the next thing that I want to do is I want to add a few callbacks, as we talked about callbacks in a previous session. So I'm going to do the slide one, which basically whenever we're starting to slide, we will update it, and whenever we change, we'll update it. So we're going to make sure that it's always getting updated, and I'm going to call the function update background. And I'm going to do the same thing for the change, and I'm going to call update background, same function. All that's left for me to do is actually to create that function. So I'm just going to get myself a little bit of space here and create a new function, and I'm going to call it update background. Now, update background, because it's an event, callbacks are events as well. We're going to get our event object, and we're going to get our UI objects, which would have extra information about our UI element. In our case, our UI element has the extra information of value. So if I really wanted to see it, I could call my console, as we did in previous videos, and just do a log for our UI value. And if we do that and we save this, we go into our application and refresh it and open up our developer error console or web inspector with whatever browser that you're working in, and I start sliding the slider, you'll start seeing that the values are updating, and you'll see also that they go all the way up to 255, which is exactly what we want them to do. All that's left for us to do is to make sure that our background updates as well. So let's try to do that. So in our code, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into our update background. Now that I got a value and I know I'm getting a value, what I want to do is I want to convert it into a hexadecimal string, which that really means basically when you're working with colors, we were working with these colors. If you don't know it now, then it's a good thing to know. The colors are broken down into red, green, and blue. Every 2 letters represents those channels of colors, and together they create all the different colors that our computer is capable of creating. So in our case, if we zoom into the red, the values that it could have are between 1 and 255. Now, the way they're drawn out inside of here, instead of using digits, which would have to take 3 digits, they're drawn out using basically a number system that instead of counting from 1 until 10 using 10 different digits, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Instead of that, it's 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, A, B, C, D, E, F. And that's all you really need to know, because now you have 255 variations that you could put inside those 2 letters. But it's literally just the exact same thing as working with numbers. It just looks a bit weird if you don't know how to work with it. So literally what we want to do is we want to take whatever value we have here and convert it to that system. And it's quite easy to do it in JavaScript by using the toString function. And in the toString function, all we have to do is tell JavaScript that this number, we want to basically convert it into a string, but in a format of 16. And that's all we really had to do, because there's 16 possible combinations in this letter zone. So now once we've done that, once we turned it into a hexadecimal value, if we look into our console again and click on refresh, this time around when we move it, we'll see that our values first start off the way that they were before, but now you start seeing C, D, E, F. It will never grow more than 2 characters. So even if we go all the way up to the 255, well, in our case, up 255, you'll see that the value FF comes back, which is 255. Now, our only problem is we can't stick all the, basically I want to take this value and duplicate it by 3 and just create whatever value color comes out. My only problem is to combine these, I need to make sure that if there's only 1 digit, then I'm going to add in a trailing 0 before. So to do that, let's just do it. So in our code, we're gonna type your basically we'll just create here a variable, and it's going to be the hex value, and our hex value is going to be the value that came back. And all really we want to do is we want to check that our hex value length is greater than 1, or if it's not equal to. So let's do that. If the length is not 2, then we want to append a value to it. So we're going to turn the hex, and we're going to make the hex equal 0 plus hex. So we're overriding our hex value, turning it into with a trailing 0. All that's left for us to do is just double check and make sure that our hex value is really working the way we wanted it to. And if we go back into our application and click refresh and just move around our trail, we'll see that we have a trailing value. Once we cross the trailing area, there won't be a trailing value anymore. The value will just be the number itself. And literally all that's left for us to do to create a complete number is just to take that hex value, now that it's set, is just take that hex value and just convert it into the real hex values as we could see in the background in our style. And all we have left to do is just add your plus hex, plus hex, plus hex. And by the way, if you were building it on your own, how about build it with 3 different sliders and combine those values together, basically creating hex 1, 2, 3 or RGB. In our case, we're using the same value for all the values. And literally just because we're trying to create a quick sample, or as quick as we could at this stage of our application, with giving you all the information that you need so you could take it on your own. And you can see that we have here a value that is valuable. All that's left for us to do is to make sure that our background updates, and that's easy as well. We've done similar work before. So instead of calling our console, it's time for us to actually approach our CSS functions in jQuery. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to approach my body itself, and the body itself I want to approach its CSS It's CSS, not CXX. So I want to approach basically the CSS, and I want to call a few properties. So I'm going to send it an object, and actually I'm going to go to the background, and I'm going to set the background to our hex value. And that's really all I had to do with my application to create basically a slider that changes its background. Now, I made a small mistake actually, because with the CSS function, I believe that it's without the object, but that's what errors are for. I might have not needed to send an object. I might have needed to send just the 2 parameters, but let's check it out. If it works, that means I didn't make a mistake. If it didn't work, then I probably need to redo that element. And then my video got a little bit longer than it needed to be. And I'm going to move this around, and actually, no, everything is working. I was right. My memory didn't fail me this time around. And you can see, and by the way, the reason why we're going from black to white and you don't see any color variations is because we're updating all our colors at the same time, our red, green, blue at the same time. If we would be updating only one of them, then we would have a completely different story. We would have a whole gamut of different colors. But if we're updating our values, our red, green, and blue at the same time, always the gamut is really going from total white when it's full to total darkness, which is black. So that covers the slider. So let's move on to some other titles and hopefully grab a few other components before our time runs out. Welcome back, and it's time for us to work on the jQuery UI accordion widget. We'll start us off with just having a little bit of copy in our application by having basically title, some text, title text, and we want to turn that into an accordion. So let's look into our code and get started. In our text editor, if we scroll down to our area, we'll see that we have a div layer, which is called topics. It has an ID of topic. And in it, literally, we have an h2 tag, then a paragraph, an h2 tag, then a paragraph, and so on and so forth. Very, very organized, very simple. Now, let's try to turn that into an accordion, and we'll do the exact same thing as we did with all the other components. Literally, we just want to approach that specific element, that ID topics, and we want to tell it that it's going to be an accordion. Not with an uppercase A, lowercase. Make sure that that's right. Open close bracket, and save. And all that's left is for us to click on refresh, and we just got ourselves an accordion. So simple, we did that in literally a couple of seconds. So that worked really well, and we have an accordion, and it's working. But there might be scenarios, and this is the only thing I want to say about accordion, which is really, really important. In a real live application, when you're working on it, you might get a scenario where actually your titles and your copy is not that organized and you can't change it. Let's say, for example, your content is inside of a div layer, and that div layer, just to prepare us to the next video, so I'm going to give these div layers IDs. So let's give me this an ID of topic 1. And we're going to do the same thing. Basically, we're going to break this down into separate different div layers, because that's just the scenario that we're in. It was in different layers, and how do you deal with it? How do you make sure that the accordion will work? Because the accordion by default won't know how to fetch the titles, because it will think that the whole cluster, it could get confused. So let's see basically what will happen once I take all this copy, and I basically created 3 different div layers separating all these components, saving it, clicking on the refresh file, and what basically will happen is the component gets confused. It gets confused, and it thinks that all the content within the first thing it sees is a title, and so on and so forth, and that's obviously not what we want it to do. So we want to force jQuery UI to do it differently. To do that, we'll have to go into our component and add an option. So in the object, I'm going to add an option that's called header. And in the header itself, I'm basically going to tell it, what do I want to change? I want to tell it what is specifically the header. To tell it what specifically is the header, I'm going to say to it inside of it's going to be a div layer, and in it, we're going to have an h2 tag. And that's literally all I had to do to tell jQuery UI, I want this to be my title. And jQuery UI will be smart enough to figure out then what the body is. So if I click on it again, you'll see that now it finds the right content and it breaks it down the way I want it to be. And that's literally the most important thing you need to know about the accordion. All the rest you could find in the documentation. It's very intuitive, very simple to play with, and you're always welcome to ask me any question you have. You could find me on Twitter at 0togeek. That's about it, so let's move on to the next topic. Alright, so last we left off the jQuery UI accordion. We made a little bit of parallels to the tabs, and really the tabs are very similar, but there's definitely some differences. While accordions automatically jQuery UI would figure out what content needs to go in, and we would facilitate if it didn't. With tabs, it's completely different. We actually tell it explicitly what will be in each tab. So let's see how it's done. And by the way, one of the main reasons is because tabs usually have external content, and it's not content that's baked inside of the page using Ajax. So to do it, basically, let's start off with updating our tabs, our page title to be tabs, and we're going to delete the accordion. Once we do that, literally all that we have to do is make sure that we have buckets of information. And in this case, we do. So let's say we want the first layer to be the topic 1, and then this topic 2 and 3. So we have an ID because we need to have a way to access it. And lucky for us, we already prepped that in advance in the accordion section. Now, next step for us is we need to create the menu itself, and the menu itself is created using an unordered list. Once we create that unordered list, that basically, if you again recall from our course on working with menus, the video on menus, you will recall that basically the way a menu is built is literally the exact same way the way you create a menu for the tabs. Now, in the link themselves, because we're referring to internal elements, I'm going to start with a hashtag and then the ID of whatever area that I want to link to, such as topic 1. I'll give it also a topic, so I'll give it a title, such as Why Us. And I'm just going to duplicate this process also a couple of times to the next 2 items that we have. So we have our topic 2 and topic 3. And I'm just going to grab that our value is number 2 and fill the information up. And in our last one, our last pitch, we will find that as well and add that into our third step here. And literally, we created everything we need to do from the HTML's perspective to create a completely valid and a car alarming in the background is always nice, but hopefully it stopped. Good. All right. So there we go. So we basically created our content and we created basically hyperlinks that could take us to those specific elements. Literally, all that's left for us to do is to basically activate it by calling our tabs, just as we've done before with other components. So let's do it with our tabs element, with our tabs widget. So I first want to approach our topics, and then I want to make it a tabs by calling the tabs function and rendering it. Time for us to render, refresh our page. We probably have here a small little error. Let's open the debugger to see what it is. So let's see, we don't have here any noticeable error. So let's go to our code. We might have not saved it. I'm going to click on save again. Everything here looks to me okay. Oh, I didn't put here a hashtag. So there is no error because there is no such thing as a tab topics. It just didn't call it. But that's one of those sneaky stuff with JavaScript that you could very easily not notice. So literally, just because we didn't put the hashtag to call our topics, it didn't work. So I'm going to save that and go back into our application. And we could probably close the debugger because we wouldn't find that information in the debugger. Click on refresh, and there we go. Now our tab system is working. So before we wrap up this video, let's add one more really exciting, cool thing that you could do with tabs, like we talked about earlier, that you could actually add in live data from external source using Ajax. And you don't even need to know Ajax, which is probably one of the coolest part of this. So literally, you want to go to that menu. You don't even add anything in. All you have to do is just create another menu element. And in that menu element, you could literally add external content. So let's say for this example, let me add my website. And let me put my website's title right up there. And let me also add another link to my, let's say, my Twitter account. So my Twitter account. And that's it. That's all I had to do. And I just added another 2 submenus. So if I click on to refresh, I'll see that now I have the 0 to geek and the 0 to geek attribute strudel. If I click onto it, literally it's just going to load inside of our tab the whole website. If you click onto the 0 to geek, it should load in Twitter. So it's going to take it a little bit of a while and then it'll load it, or it'll have an error. And if it has an error, it won't succeed. But in this case, it succeeded and it actually loaded it in. And because it's trying to log me in, so we can't even see our pages. So let me just click on there to get rid of that. And there you go. So that's literally all you need to know, the basics of tabs, the basics of all the jQuery components. And I hope you explore them and enjoy them as much as I did, and as much as I hope you had a good time in this section. It could only mean one thing when you see there's no green screen behind me. It means we're done. It means we're in a relaxed mode and I'm here to celebrate with you a really great job. So you just completed everything you need to know about the basics of jQuery UI and you're ready to jump into the world and start using it. And I do encourage you as your next step to literally just start working with it, start reading the documentation of it. Obviously, there's a lot more that you could learn, such as advanced mechanisms with advanced features, advanced ways of working with jQuery UI, such as building your own components, or digging deeper into the library of jQuery in general. You could find that and much more in Pact publications in general. Just go onto the Pact site, which is packed with goodies, videos, and books, among them this course that is mine, and the Pact book, HTML graphing and data visualization cookbook. Very big word, but just search for Ben Falla and you will find that title even on Google. And that's about it. And I really hope you joined that one as well. I hope you loved it. Please, if you do, stop by wherever you are and write a nice comment. If it's on your blog, if it's on directly on Pact, if it's on Amazon, wherever you purchased the book, please do give us a review, because that's the only way people will know about the book, about the course, about this video course, and also about the book if you bought the book as well. Alrighty, so if you want to ask me any questions, you have any concern, you want to know what am I going to do next, you're always welcome to send me an email at ben@zerotogeek.com, or you could just follow me at Tweety, which is at zerotogeek, where you'll find everything about what I'm up to and what is the next thing I'm going to be doing. Alright, so thank you very much, and yep, that's about it. Congratulations.